Hi class, and welcome to lecture 4 of our Modern Metaphysics unit. So we're going to look at the epistemological ideas of the Enlightenment philosopher David Hume. In the last lecture, we talked about empiricism. We talked about Hume's model of perception. We talked about impressions versus ideas. We talked about essentially false complex ideas and where they come from versus accurate complex ideas, and we sort of broke his whole model of perception down. And then this is where we left off. So I want to start by talking about the fact that, as we mentioned last time, Hume saw his epistemological project as a way of making sure that what we were saying made sense. That when we come up with false ideas, false abstractions, a lot of times that's because those ideas can't be traced back to reality in a sense. They don't correspond to any basic sensory impressions or sense perceptions, okay? And we use complex ideas all the time without stopping to think whether or not they correspond to reality, essentially, okay? And for Hume, the problem occurs when we try to infer things inductively from past evidence. And what we do is typically we observe patterns and we infer that those patterns will continue in the future, assuming nature will behave in a uniform way. And you can see all that on the slide. One thing I want to say right off the bat that makes Hume different from someone like Berkeley. We started our lecture series with Berkeley, who is a hard empiricist or an idealist. Hume, the thing that differentiates idealism from empiricism is that empiricism isn't making the claim that Berkeley's making. Berkeley says that the world consists only of minds. You can't prove that there's an external reality out there. In fact, the most likely case is that you're seeing your perceptions of things. You don't have access to things in themselves. You can't prove that they exist out there. Why are you having sense perceptions in the first place? If there isn't an external reality, well, God put them there. For Hume, the big difference here is that Hume is not denying the reality of the external world. Hume is not an idealist. Hume does not claim that reality is perception. It's a little more complicated than that. For Hume, there might be a reality that exists outside of you. In fact, he believes there is. He's not denying that. That is why you have sense impressions in the first place. That is why you see objects out there in the external world. So Hume doesn't lapse into solipsism in the same way that Berkeley does. For Hume, objects do exist outside of perception, and that is why you're perceiving them in the first place. Now, you can't but see those objects in and through your narrow subjectivity. So the way that you see them is through your imperfect senses, and the way that you gain knowledge is through the senses. And of course, he's an empiricist, so he believes knowledge comes from experience. And so one of the examples that Hume uses in his essay concerning human understanding is he gives the example of the sun rising. We see the sun rise every morning and we assume it will rise again tomorrow. That's one of the examples he uses. And I want to now get into what I promised we would talk about in the last lecture, which is Hume's distinction between demonstrative and probable statements. So for Hume, statements, propositions can be broken down in two different ways, okay? There are demonstrative statements and there are probable statements. Demonstrative statements are just relations of ideas, okay? So propositions which express necessary truths. So these are truths that are known to be true or false a priori. That means prior to experience. The Latin means from the earlier. A priori propositions, okay? That's one type of statement that you can make about the world, according to Hume. A priori propositions are propositions whose justification does not rely on experience, okay? A lot of people get this wrong, right? So for example, 2 + 2 = 4 is an a priori proposition. What you're saying is that 2 things added to 2 things equals 4 things. Okay, and the reason that Hume categorizes this as a demonstrative statement or as a relationship of ideas is that denying this statement actually involves a logical contradiction. And so students will get this wrong sometimes, and they'll say, what do you mean, Mr. Hill? Two is an invented concept, and the word that we use for two is something that we've made up and constructed, et cetera, et cetera. That's not at all what a priori means, and that's not what Hume is saying, right? Sure, you could have a different language. We have many languages. You could be an alien, and you could say Blork plus Blork equals Schmork. It doesn't matter. This type of truth is the type of truth that relies on the relationship between ideas. So that's why he calls them relations of ideas. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is an equation and expresses a mathematical relationship. You can call the numbers whatever you want, but 2 things plus 2 concrete things equals 4 things, right? So this is something that is a priori true, right? It is one whose truth or falsity is self-evident. It's a given. To deny that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is to assert a logical contradiction. Now, a lot of kids will take that to the next step and they'll say, well, hold on a minute. Don't you need to have had the idea of the number 1 first? Don't you have to have experienced one thing or seen the numbers before on a piece of paper to be able to do 2 plus 2 equals 4? Now, the proposition indeed can be validated by experience. That's true, but it's an a priori proposition because it's not grounded in experience, okay? What a priori means is that a priori means that the justification, right, confirming it, justifying it, knowing that it's the case does not rely upon experience, right? So another way to think of this is that a priori knowledge is knowledge whose truth is not confirmed by sense data, right? To confirm that 2 plus 2 equals 4, you need not point out at anything in the world and say, oh, look at that, okay? To know that it's true, you don't need to point to anything using your senses, okay? So it's knowledge whose truth is not confirmed via sense data. So 3 plus 2 equals 5, right, is a mathematical truth that expresses a relationship, right? Here's another type of a priori truth, tautologies. Things like all bachelors are unmarried, right? And then students will say, well, wait a minute, don't you have to have the concept of a bachelor? And don't you have to have the concept of someone who's unmarried, et cetera, et cetera? Sure. In order to say the words, in order to say the sentence, all bachelors are unmarried, you need to know language and you need to have the ability to wield language. True, that's all true. But the statement, all bachelors are unmarried, is a tautology. The subject is contained within the predicate. So if you said that all bachelors are married, that would be a logical contradiction. Okay, and then things, of course, like deductions from pure reason, like ontological proofs. Okay, so the justification of a priori propositions do not depend on experience. There's nothing in experience that you need to consult to determine whether all bachelors are unmarried or whether 7 plus 5 equals 12. Okay, so now even Kant admits this, right? As Kant would grant, experience is required to understand the concepts bachelor and unmarried and 7 and so forth. However, the a priori, a posteriori distinction isn't referring to the origins of the concepts, but to their justification as propositions. So once we have the concepts, right, once you know what a bachelor is, once you can add and use the number 7 and add it to 5, experience is no longer necessary, right? So another thing I want to say about a priori truths is that a priori truths are propositions that are necessarily true, okay? So they're true in all possible worlds, or as philosophers say, they're true in every possible world. Again, take the proposition all bachelors are unmarried. Its negation, right? the proposition that some bachelors are married, that would be incoherent, since the concept of being unmarried, or the meaning of the word unmarried, is tied to the concept of being a bachelor, or the definition of the word bachelor. That's what I mean when I say the subject is contained within the predicate. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about a posteriori propositions, okay? A posteriori propositions are what Hume called probable statements. They're matters of facts. So they're not self-evident. They actually require you to point to something in experience to prove it true or false, right? Take the statement, Mr. Hill is in this room, right? That is not self-evidently true. It's not true in all possible worlds. Its confirmation as a truth is something that you have to point to. You all see me in a room. You can point to me. I'm in this room. Here I am. If someone were next to me, they would be able to point to me and say, oh, yeah, Mr. Hill actually is in this room. I can see him. I've confirmed it using my senses. I can see him. I can touch him. I can hear him speaking. These aren't self-evident, right? They're not relations of ideas. They're not about how ideas relate to one another, right? And they're not even necessary truths. It doesn't have to be the case that I'm in this room. I could just as easily not be in this room. If you asserted that I was not in this room, you might be wrong, but saying so does not express a logical contradiction. For example, when it comes to a posteriori propositions, you could say something like, well, all bachelors are unhappy. Okay, now that's different than all bachelors are unmarried, right? The truth of all bachelors are unmarried is tautological. It's A equals A, right? It couldn't but be true. All bachelors are unhappy? Well, you're actually going to have to go out and investigate. You're going to have to do a study. You're going to have to talk to bachelors and figure out whether the unmarried life makes you unhappy. And you could do research on that. We would call that social science. Tables exist, right? That's an a posteriori proposition, right? The Earth is the third planet from the Sun. That is an a posteriori proposition. So a posteriori means, right, that these are propositions whose justification does rely on experience, right? And in other words, the proposition is validated by and grounded in experience. So remember when I said a priori knowledge is logically necessary, right? It's a necessary truth. That's what we call it in philosophy. Well, an a posteriori proposition is a contingent truth, right? It depends, right? You would have to confirm its truth via experience, right? So it's logically contingent, okay? Any justification of them would require your experience. And another way to think about this is that they're contingent because their negation, right, is not self-contradictory, right? So, in other words, it's not true in every possible world. It's not that these truths must be the case, it's that they happen to be the case, which is what makes them contingent, which is why philosophers chose the word contingent, okay? And so, good, we can move on from there. All right, so in his inquiry concerning human understanding, Hume actually gives a few more examples, okay? And the big example that I mentioned earlier is this proposition, the sun will rise tomorrow, right? And think about it this way. We usually take the statement, the sun will rise tomorrow, we usually take it to be a necessary truth. Like it happens every day, it's necessary, that's just what happens, right? It's just what the sun does. Actually, it's not what the sun does. It's the Earth rotating on its axis. But my point is that we tend to think that it's automatic and self-evident that the sun will rise tomorrow. That's our sort of egoistic version of things. We talk about the sun rising for us, even though it technically doesn't. But the sun will rise tomorrow is actually not a necessary truth. And a lot of people get Hume confused here. Hume is not saying that the sun won't rise tomorrow. He would probably admit that the sun rising tomorrow is very likely to happen. In fact, it's probably almost certainly going to happen, okay? But it's not a necessary truth. It doesn't have to be the case. And what Hume's doing here is he's not trying to make ordinary experience, he's not trying to make knowledge, he's not trying to make discourse or reasoning impossible. He's trying to make a really crucial distinction, and he's using the sun will rise tomorrow as an example, as a way of showing you the difference between contingent and necessary truths. It is not a necessary truth. It doesn't have to rise tomorrow. It's not a demonstrative statement, right? It's not a claim, whether it rises or doesn't, is not a proposition about the relations between ideas. In other words, claiming the opposite, that the sun will not rise tomorrow, it may turn out that you're wrong when the sun does indeed rise the next day, but claiming that it doesn't involve a logical contradiction, right? It's possible that that could happen, right? Maybe the Earth will stop rotating on its axis. Maybe the Earth will somehow cease to make one complete turn every 24 hours, right? Maybe there will be some sort of apocalyptic impact or disaster, right? It's not a logical contradiction to suggest that the sun will not rise tomorrow. And so what he's doing is he's making a distinction between two types of knowledge. And so what you're really doing is you're taking causal statements. So take the following statement: event A causes B. Now compare that to the statement 2 + 2 = 4, right? Event A causes B is not necessarily true in every possible world. 2 + 2 = 4 is universally true in an a priori fashion, okay? And what Hume's trying to get at here is he's trying to get to this idea that the expectation of one thing following another does not lie in the things themselves, but it's a connection that we make in our mind, okay? So for Hume, the denial of a statement whose truth condition is grounded in causality is not inconceivable and hence not impossible, okay? Conceivability for Hume, and this is a big part of his philosophy, implies possibility. It is possible that the sun will not rise tomorrow, okay? Hume's trying to point out here that the expectation of one thing following another does not lie in the things themselves, but in our mind. It's something that we project onto the world. So, again, Hume's not saying that there aren't physical laws that govern the universe. He's saying that our knowledge of causality is not the same kind as our knowledge of, say, math, okay? So what then is cause and effect? For Hume, cause and effect is force of habit arrived at through the experience of constant conjunction, right? And he defines constant conjunction as the human tendency to read or project uniformity and causal connection into our experience of isolated impressions, okay? So in his inquiry concerning human understanding, Hume brings up this idea of the billiard, of basically watching two people playing billiards, okay? And he gives the example of a billiard ball striking another, okay? And he says in his book, no matter how clever we are, the only way we can infer if and how the second billiard ball will move is via past experience, right? There is nothing in the cause that will ever imply the effect in an experiential vacuum. Cause and effect are human projections, okay? And he's not saying that causality isn't operative in the world, and he's not saying physical laws don't exist. This is about your knowledge and your perception. We think we're observing some external force called causality operating in the external world, okay? When really, as human beings, all we observe is that the motion of, in the billiard case, the first billiard ball is followed by the motion of the second billiard ball. We never observe the act of causation. We project it onto that. It wouldn't actually be a logical contradiction to suggest that the billiard ball if it hits the other billiard ball at a certain angle, that maybe the billiard ball will stay perfectly still. It's not likely. It is probably not ever going to happen unless you make the billiard ball extremely heavy. What Hume is saying is that it wouldn't be a logical contradiction to suggest that that could happen. Saying so does not imply inherently a logical contradiction. And so here's the third bullet point down there. The grounds for our belief that the sun will rise tomorrow or that the 8-ball will move when the cue ball slams into it are not logical. They're simply the result of our conditioning. And here it's important to remember that the way that cause and effect works for us is, and we talked about this in the last lecture, is that the mind naturally associates ideas via resemblance and contiguity, right? And so we talked about that last lecture. By the way, Hume isn't saying that if you've never seen a game of billiards before, you've never played pool before, that you wouldn't be able to figure out what the effect of one ball hitting another from a certain angle is going to be. If you've never seen a game of pool, what you would do, according to Hume, is use resemblance to infer an analogous case from your experience, from your past experience of transferred momentum, of deflection. Maybe you could apply your knowledge of geometry. Otherwise, you wouldn't even be able to play pool. So Hume's point is that the human mind is not equipped with the ability to observe causal relations. In other words, you don't see the causation itself. What you see is one event following the other. You tend to think that you see the causation, right? But what you really see is that one ball is moving, hits the other one, and stops, and the second ball is moving. That's what you see, okay? And so, Hume listed 3 requirements for calling a relation causal, right? And again, think about it. This depends on us. Universal association between x and y, okay? Time precedence of x by y, or y by x in this case. Spatiotemporal connection between x and y. These are how we project causality onto the world. And again, to go back to this here, cause and effect, and that's your answer, is force of habit arrived at through the experience of constant conjunction. Our tendency as human beings to project uniformity and causal connection into our experience of isolated impressions. And there are many studies, psychological studies of human perception that actually confirm many of Hume's ideas in terms of what people see, what they think they see, and that sort of thing. And so, just so that this is clear for you, I laid it out nicely here in a little chart. This is, I want to give credit where credit is due. This is from the famous DK philosophy book. And philosophy book is this nice book of philosophical ideas that lays everything out into nice little pictures. So Hume would say this: I see the sun rise every morning. I get into a habit of expecting the sun to rise every morning. I refine this into the judgment, the sun rises every morning. This judgment cannot be empirical, though, because I cannot observe future risings of the sun. This judgment cannot be a truth of logic, because the sun not rising, however unlikely that seems to us, is conceivable. Therefore, I have no rational grounds for my belief, but custom and habit tells me that it is an indubitable fact of life. Custom is the great guide of life. And so that's what Hume is doing here. This will complete our discussion of David Hume. These are some of the big sort of Cliff Notes, shortened, condensed version of Hume's ideas. And what I want to tell you is the next person that we're going to do in Lecture 5 is Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant is a great Enlightenment thinker, and Immanuel Kant really does synthesize, okay, empiricism and rationalism. Rationalism being the idea that all knowledge starts with the mind, right? That the basis of knowledge is the set of ideas we have. It's the mental element. And empiricism is the idea that all knowledge starts with the senses. And what Kant really does nicely is fuse these two things, merge them together, and create a unity between rationalism and empiricism. He kind of disproves, or at least makes better arguments that take us beyond rigid philosophies like idealism, right? And also he refines and makes more sophisticated the claims of empiricists like David Hume and John Locke. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you for the next lecture.